Hi, I'm Papa Joe. Thank you very much for joining me to read today. Today's book is Where the Buffalo Begin. It's an absolutely wonderful story about a 10-year-old Indian boy who traces the legend of where the buffalo begin on the Great Plains. Couple of interesting things about this book. One, it's a Caldecott Medal winner. The Caldecott Medal is awarded annually by the American Library Association for illustration of children's books. And second, it was written by Olaf Baker. Olaf Baker wrote it over 100 years ago, but Stephen Gabel did the illustrations for it in the 1980s. So it's a very old story with relatively new, beautiful illustrations. Over the blazing campfires, where the wind moaned eerily through the thickets of juniper and fir, they spoke of it in the Indian tongue. They spoke of that strange lake southward, whose waters never rest. And Nawa, the medicine man, who had lived such countless moons that not even the oldest members of the tribe could remember a time when Nawa was not old. Nawa declared that if you arrived at the right time on the right night, you would see the buffaloes arise out of the middle of the lake and come crowding to the shore. For there, he said, was the sacred spot where the buffaloes began. It was not only Nawa who declared that the buffaloes had their beginnings underwater, born in the depths of the lakes. The Indian legends, far older even than Nawa, said the same thing, and Nawa was the only voice that kept the legend living on two legs. And often in the winter, when the wind drove with a roar over the prairies and came thundering up the creek, making the teepees strain and shudder, Little Wolf would listen to it and think it sounded like a stampede of the buffaloes. And then he would snuggle warmly under the buffalo robe that was his blanket and be thankful for the shelter of the teepee. And sometimes he would go very far down in the shadowy ways of thick sleep, and there he would meet the buffaloes as they came up from the lake, with the water shining on their shaggy coats and their horns gleaming in the moon. And the buffaloes would begin by being very terrible and shaking their great heads at him, as if they fully intended to make an end of him there and then. But afterwards, they would come up close to him and smell him and change their minds, and be companionable after all. Little Wolf was only 10 years old, but he could run faster than any of the Indian boys in his group, and the wildest pony was not too wild for him to capture and ride. But the great thing about him was that he had no fear. He knew that an angry bull bison would gore you to death, and that a prairie wolves, if they ran you down, there would be nothing left to you but your bones. Also, he was well aware that if you fell into the hands of the terrible Assisiboine, they would kill you and take your scalp as neatly as could be. Yet none of these things terrified him. Only, being very wise for his age, he had a clear understanding for the present that it was best to just keep out of their way. But all these thoughts that ran this way and that in his quick brain, the one that galloped the hardest was the thought of the great lake to the south, where the buffaloes began. And as the days lengthened and the spring became something that you could smell on the warm, blowing air, the thought grew bigger and bigger in Little Wolf's brain. At last, it was so very big that Little Wolf couldn't bear it any longer, and so one morning, very early, before the village was even astir, he crept out of the teepee noiselessly and stole along below the junipers and tall firs until he came to a spot where the ponies were hobbled. The dawn was just beginning to break, and in the gray light, the ponies looked like dark blotches along the creek. But Little Wolf's eyes were very sharp, and soon he had singled out his pony, because it had one white forefoot and a white patch on his left side. And when he spoke, calling softly, the animal whinnied in answer and allowed himself to be caught. Little Wolf unhobbled him, slipped on the bridle which he had brought with him, and leaped lightly on his back. A few minutes later, horse and rider had left the camp behind them, and they were out upon the prairies, going south. When the sun rose, they were already far upon their way. Little Wolf swept his piercing gaze around the immense horizon in case there should be any danger, anything moving in ambush that might interrupt his journey or make him alter his course. Far off, so far that as to be just on the edge of his sight, there was a dim spot on the yellowish gray of the prairie. Little Wolf reined his pony to see if it moved. If it did, it crept so slowly as to seem absolutely still. He decided that it was a herd of antelope feeding and that there was nothing to fear. As he went, hour after hour, never ceasing to watch, the prairie grouse got up almost under the pony's feet, and the larks and the savanna sparrows filled the air with their singing, and everywhere the wild roses were in bloom. It seemed as if nothing but peace would ever find its way among the singing birds and flowers, yet Little Wolf knew well that the Assiniboine could come creeping along the hollows of the prairie like wolves, and that no moment is more dangerous than the time when there is no hint of danger. All this time he had not seen a single buffalo, but he told himself that this was because the herds had taken some other way, and that he would probably not see any until he was near the lake. He lost sight of the shadowy spot he had seen so far away. If he had known that it was in fact a party of Assiniboine warriors, he might have thought twice about continuing to the lake, and would probably have returned along his trail to give warning to his people. But his head was too full of the singing of the birds and the breath of the roses, and above all, the great thought of the buffalo fighting below the lake. It was late in the afternoon when at last he sighted the lake. It lay like a gray sheet with a glint of silver glimmering under the sun. He looked eagerly on all sides to see if there were any signs of buffalo, but far and wide the prairie lay utterly deserted. It was very warm and still in the white shimmer of the air. As he approached nearer, however, he saw many trails, all going in one direction and leading towards the lake. There were antelope and coyote, wolf and buffalo. All these had left traces behind them as they went for water and returned. But it was the buffalo trails that were most numerous and marked, and which Little Wolf noted above all the others. When he was quite close to the lake, he dismounted, and, hobbling his pony, he turned him loose to graze. Then he himself lay down beside some tussocks of prairie grass above the low bank at the edge of the lake, and he waited. From this position he could overlook the lake without being seen, and he gazed far over its glittering expanse, very still just now under the strong beams of the sun. It was disappointingly still. Scarcely a ripple broke on the shore. You could not possibly imagine that the buffaloes were struggling underneath. Little Wolf asked himself, where was the movement and the mysterious murmur of which Nawa had spoken? But, being Indian, he was not impatient. He could afford to wait and listen for hours and hours if need be. The time went on, and slowly the sun dipped westward, and the shadows of the grass grew longer. Yet still the lake kept its outward stillness, and nothing happened. At last, the sun reached the horizon, lay there for a few moments, and a great ball of flame, and then sank out of sight. Twilight fell, and all over the vast wilderness crept a peculiar silence, like a wild creature stealing from its lair, while far in the west there lingered a strange orange light that belonged to the prairie skies alone when the sun is down, and the night wind sighed along the grass. And whether it was the singing of the wind or not, Little Wolf could not tell, but there came to him along the margin of the lake a strange, low murmur that died away and arose again. As the night deepened, it grew clearer, and then he was certain that it was not the wind, but it came from the very center of the lake. For hours he lay and listened, but the mysterious murmur never ceased. Sometimes it was a little louder and sometimes a little softer, but always it was plain to hear, a wonderful and terrible thing in the silence of the night. And as Little Wolf lay watching under the stars, the words of Nawa kept singing in his head. Do you hear the noise that never ceases? It is the buffalo fighting far below. They are fighting to get out upon the prairie. They are born below the water, but they are fighting for the air in the great lake to the southland, where the buffaloes begin. Suddenly, Little Wolf lifted himself up. He could not tell whether he'd been asleep or not, but there in the lake, he saw a wonderful sight. The buffaloes. There they were, hundreds and hundreds of them, rising up out of the lake. He could not see the surface anymore. Instead, he saw a lake of swaying bodies and heads that shook on, and on their horns and tossing their heads, the water gleamed in the moonlight as he had seen it in his dreams. Little Wolf felt the blood run along his body. He clutched at the prairie grass, crushing it in his hot hands where his pulse throbbed. Though with staring eyes, he drank in the great vision. And he did not only drink it in with his eyes, he also drank it in with his ears and his nose, for his ears were filled with the trampling and snorting of the herd and the flash of the water as they moved it with their feet, and his nose drank in the sharp, moist noise of the great beasts upon each other, the smell that the wolves knew well when they came dropping down out of the wind. Little Wolf Little Wolf never knew what came to him, nor what spirit of the wild it was that whispered in his ear, but suddenly he leaped to his feet and let loose a ringing cry from his throat. And when he cried, he flung his arms up over his head, and then he cried again. At the first cry, a shiver like an electric thrill passed through the herd. As if they were one beast, the buffalo threw up their heads and listened, absolutely still. They saw in the white light of the moon a little wild boy above the margin of the lake, making swift motions with his arms. He seemed to speak with his arms, to talk buffalo talk, with the ripple of his muscles and the snapping of his fingers in the air. They had never seen such a thing before. Their little eyes fastened upon him excitingly and shot out sparks of light. And when he cried out again, there swept through the stillness of the herd a stir, a movement, a ripple that you could see. And the ripple became a wave, and the wave became a billow. And it was a billow of buffaloes that, beginning at the outskirts of the herd, broke along the margins of the lake in a terrifying roar. It was a wonderful sound, that roar of the buffaloes at the edge of the stampede. It rolled far out upon the prairie and in the hollow silence of the night. Wandering wolves caught it, and they threw their noses up to the moon, and they howled an answering cry. It was the hour when, on the lovely prairie lands, the feet of the wild folk pad softly. The sound carries an immense distance. But the ears it might have warned, the quick ears of the Uspawan warriors, did not catch it, being too far off upon the northern trail. On moccasins, noiseless as the padded feet of the wolves, as watchful and almost more cruel, these painted warriors were stealthily approaching the camp of Little Wolf's people, determined to wipe them out before the dog star faded from the dawn. But now the buffaloes had received the strange message that the Indian boy waved to them from the margin of the lake. He himself didn't understand it. He cried out to the buffalo because he could not help it, because he loved them as the creatures of his dreams. And when he saw and heard their answer, when they came surging out of the lake like a mighty flood, bellowing and stamping and tossing their heads, a wild excitement possessed him, and for the first time in his life, he knew the meaning of fear. Swift as a wolf, his namesake, He darted towards his pony. To unhobble it and leap upon its back took but a moment. Then he was off, riding for his life. Behind him came the terrible sound of the buffaloes as they swept out of the lake. He threw a quick glance behind to see which way they took, and he saw the dark, surging mass throw itself out upon the prairie and come at a gallop, heading due north. Little Wolf turned his pony's head slightly westward to escape the middle rush of the herd. If the buffaloes surrounded him on all sides, he did not know what might happen. If his pony had been fresh, he could have easily outstripped the buffaloes, but after a long day, the animal was tired and was going at half his usual speed. Little Wolf threw a quick glance over his shoulder, and the buffalo were gaining. He cried to the pony, short, little cries that made a wild noise in the night. Soon they were swept along. The leaders of the left flank of the herd drew so close that he could hear the snorting sound of their breath. Then, when they were abreast of him, the pony and the buffaloes were galloping side by side, and yet did nothing to him. They did not seem to have any other desire but to gallop into the night. Soon Little Wolf was completely surrounded by buffaloes, in front, behind, and on both sides, and he saw a heaving mass of buffaloes that bewildered the sea. Again, as when he had cried out beside the lake, a wild feeling of excitement seized him, and he felt blood stir all along his scalp. And once again he cried aloud, flinging his arms above his head in a long, ringing cry, and the buffalo replied, bellowing a wild answer that rolled like thunder far along the plains. North, the great gallop swept, down the hollows, over the swells of the prairie, below the lonely ridges with piles of stone where Indians leave their dead, crashing through the alder thickets beside the creeks, and through the shallow creeks themselves, churning the water into muddy foam. The mighty herd rolled on its way, and the thunder of its coming spread terror far and wide in the hearts of all the lesser prairie folk. The antelope were off like the wind, and the badgers and the coyotes slunk into their holes. Even the wolves took warning, vanishing shadow-like along the hollows east and west, so to be well out of their way. Little Wolf was beside himself with excitement and joy. It seemed as if he, too, were a member of the herd, as if the buffaloes had adopted him and made him one of their own. Suddenly he saw something ahead. He could not see very clearly because the buffaloes were in front of him, but it looked like a band of Indians. They were not mounted. They were running swiftly on foot, as if to regain their ponies. At first, Little Wolf thought that they were his own people, as he knew by the outline of the country that the camp could not be far off. But then he saw that the men were not running towards the camp, but away from it. And very swiftly the idea flashed upon him. They were the Assiniboine, the deadly enemies of his people, and they must have left their ponies some distance off in order to approach the camp unseen through the long grass and attack Little Wolf's people in their sleep. Little Wolf knew well that unless the Assiniboine reached their ponies in time, the buffalo would cut off their retreat. Once that great herd hurled itself upon them, nothing could save them from being trampled to death. He saw the Indians making desperate efforts to escape. He cried shrilly, hoping that it would excite the buffaloes even more, and the buffaloes seemed to answer his cries. They bore down on the fleeing men at a terrible gallop, and, in spite of the long distance they had come, they never slacked their speed. One by one, the Assiniboine were overtaken, knocked down, and trampled underfoot, and the herd passed over them. Suddenly, Little Wolf's pony went down. He leaped clear as the animal fell. Fortunately, by this time, they were on the outskirts of the herd, and before Little Wolf could get to his fallen pony, the last buffalo had passed. Over the blazing campfires, when the wind cries and moans eerily through the thickets of juniper and fir, they still speak of the great lake to the south, where the buffalo begin, But now they always add the name of Little Wolf to the legend, the boy who led the buffaloes and saved his people. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed that. I love that book. Thank you.